Hello, everyone. I'm Eric D'Souza, and we are continuing our interview series with members of Crime Writers of Canada who have been shortlisted for the Awards of Excellence of 2023. Joining me today is a nominee for the award for Best Unpublished Manuscript, sponsored by ECW Press. Joanne Kormylo has written a story called Two Knots. Hi, Joanne. How are you today?
Good, thank you. And thank you for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. We've been chatting for a while now, so I know we're going to have a good story to tell. Normally, this is where I would read your bio, but in all honesty, I think if I did, it would be a little bit of a spoiler. So I'd rather we sort of ease our way into it. Because you told me beforehand that this is a passion project that you've really been wanting to do since childhood.
Yes.
So could you tell us a little bit about this story that you've written?
Yes. Well, my father was a bomber pilot and a prisoner of war in World War II. He was shot down by anti-aircraft fire and he ditched his Wellington bomber in the Zuider Sea. They were captured. All the crew survived. They were captured and they were taken to a prisoner of war camp. He was there for 2 years, 11 months. I grew up with this, but my father did not speak of it. It was very damaged after the war. So it became an integral part of my life, but it was like an unspoken legacy. I didn't understand. We had certain rules. We can talk about that later if you want in my house, but I didn't understand why we had them. Things like coffee had to be black. We couldn't have locks on our doors. He did change later when, he got older, but bread had to be white. Turnips were not allowed in the home. I always wanted to understand him. I went with him to Remembrance Day every November 11th, and he was just stoic. So unfortunately, he passed away in 1985. And he never told me. As a child, I always thought someday he would, but he didn't. So after he passed away, I started doing what I had planned to do, and I started researching. And it started out as a family history, and then it went to nonfiction. And then since I couldn't get his story from him, I felt it was probably the best idea to write it as fiction inspired by true stories, because I interviewed POWs. I sat on the board of several Aero Space Museum and the Air Force Museum of Alberta, where I got very close to several POWs who shared their stories with me. And I have his journal, I have his handcuffs, and I traveled to Europe several times. This book grew out of that.
I have so many questions after that response. Let's start with, why did the bread have to be white?
Because in the prison camp, in German prison camps, they served black bread made out of tree flour. And I found out that tree flour was sawdust. So there were certain triggers. So the bread had to be white. Anything else triggered him. Turnips were served ad nauseum. They were starving, but they got served turnips all the time. He could not. A turnip would trigger him.
I see. And you said you actually have his handcuffs?
Yes, I do. Would you like to see them?
Yes, please.
I have them in my frame. I have several frames with his medals and but if you can see this.
Yes.
Is the sunshine?
Yeah, I can see them.
They're in the frame there. So the POWs were Hitler's revenge on Dieppe. Apparently, during the Dieppe raids, the Germans uncovered British orders saying that they should bind the German prisoners they captured in order to prevent them from destroying documents. So Hitler went on to a revenge, and for several months, they bound prisoners of war with binder twine off the Red Cross parcels. And then after a couple of months, they got handcuffs, and those were the handcuffs.
And,
Sorry?
and they weren't allowed taking them off ever?
They were on till I think it was November 43. And then, but they were very cagey, like it's just amazing. The POWs, the things they did. So the handcuffs, they lived off their Red Cross parcels when they got them. And the bully beef can keys and the sardine can keys. And I think they managed to figure out a way to unlock the handcuffs. And so they would put them one cuff in each pocket. And then when the guards came around, they'd shove their hands in the pockets. And then they looked like they were wearing them. And they did that. And then they had inspections several times a day to make sure they had their handcuffs on. So they put them back on. And then there's one interesting sort of funny story about that someone told me about my dad. So one day and it's actually in my book, but one day in prison camp, there was this guard he didn't like, and they took the handcuffs off every night and they put them in a big box, and then they counted them. And one night they were one pair short. And so the guard got in trouble, and everybody got in trouble, and but they like to harass the guards. So after the war, this POW told me that he came to visit my dad, and they were talking. And he said to my dad, did you ever figure out who took those damn, handcuffs? And my dad opened his desk drawer and pulled them out. And these are them. So I thought that was cool.
Yeah, you told me that there's a story about those handcuffs. So thank you. You said that in your story, Two Knots, the male character is heavily drawn from your father, but not completely, a little bit from these other POWs that sort of filled in the gaps for you. It is also telling the story of a woman, though, who's not your mom, who was part of the Polish Home Army. Could you tell us, because I know the person in your story is based on real people. So could you tell us her story a bit?
Yes. Well, my dad was born in Poland and immigrated to Canada when he was 5, then joined the RCAF when the war broke out. But so I have his journal, and in the journal, there are photographs of Polish women in uniform behind the barbed wire. So it intrigued me, and that started my research in that direction. And the women, there were a couple hundred women that were captured in the Warsaw Uprising, and they were interned for a very short in the transit camp, in my dad's camp. And they were on the other side of the barbed wire, and the men used to throw them notes and things, notes wrapped around rocks over the barbed wire fence, and that's how they communicated. And the more I looked into it, I was told about a lady that was one of them that smuggled children out of the Warsaw Ghetto through the underground sewer system. And this is true. This is what they did, especially this organization called Zagoda, which is part of my book too. But through the underground sewer system, it's dark and there's many junctures. So what they did so that the people didn't get lost in the sewers is they hung ropes at the junction. So when it got to a junction, they would check. 2 knots meant turn right, 1 knot meant turn left. So that's why that's why I'm calling it at this time, my working title is 2 knots.
I often ask people how their past careers influenced their writing, but you were a lawyer with a lot of academia background. I'm imagining that you didn't pull from your career much to write this book, or did you?
No, not at all. I found it almost a negative, and because this is my first and only fictional project. I've never written for fiction. I found it very difficult to make the switch. So I actually now have a very good editor. He's actually a member of the organization, Crime Writers Canada, Robert Rotenberg. And he's always saying to me, "You're writing like a lawyer, quit it." I'm very expository. That's one of my weaknesses, I want to get the facts down. I want it to be authentic. So I've had to do a lot of learning to write fiction.
Well, you had a good teacher. So
Yeah.
that helps. Sorry, forgot. Last question I had for you was you mentioned that you traveled to Europe to do research. I know people do research, for their novel, but going to Europe seems maybe a little excessive. Did you learn a lot there? Was it worth it?
Oh, very much so. Very much so. I just want it to be authentic because I feel that there's so many of the World War II books that aren't authentic, and it bothers me. And I want it to be real. I want to have my facts right. And when I was just there again less than a month ago, and yeah, it's very important to me. I don't know if I mentioned there's a life-size replica of the underground brick sewers in the Warsaw Uprising Museum. And there are two existing Wellington bombers in the world. And one of them is at the Brooklyn Museum in the UK. So I went there. I wanted to get my escape hatches and everything. Like my first scene in the book is the ditching scene of the Wellington bomber. And I have do you want me to show the picture?
Sure,
I have my dad's journal. And this is a journal that the Canadian YMCA distributed to POWs during the war. And there's lots of photographs in here, but they wrote in each other's, they wrote poems, stories, they drew pictures. I think this is just beautiful. It's when someone other than my father, you see, painted that. They used things like foodstuffs. They got some paints through the Red Cross, but they used things like foodstuffs to make paints that they needed colors. So my first chapter is that. That's one thing I'm not authentic about, though, is that I have the Wellington bomber did not deliver arms to the Polish underground. They used other ones like Halifax's, but I wanted it to be a Wellington because my dad flew Wellingtons and there aren't many left and people don't know about them. So I wanted it to be a Wellington.
Fair enough.
So that, sorry?
So I was going to ask you, this is in the category of unpublished, but I'm guessing the goal is to get it published. So how's that process coming along?
Well, slow. It's been it's been a struggle. It's been a struggle. So maybe, I'm hoping. Yeah.
Well, I'm hoping this helps then.
Thank you.
Being shortlisted for the award.
Yeah, I'm sure it will.
Well, it's a sticker that you can put on, and
Yeah.
That judges appreciated your work, and then hopefully publishers will too.
Well, I'm very pleased, very, very pleased to have come this far, and I wish everybody luck. I'm really happy about it.
Well, I'm going to wish you luck.
Thank
Good
you.
luck, Joanne. And
Thank
thank
you
you,
very
everyone.
much.